Something I always remind myself is that every family has their issues, big or small. No family is perfect, and sometimes there are situations, or even scandals. What's an NSFW scandal in your family? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. I was in college before the age of DVRs, and my roommate and I would tape The Simpsons to watch later. My mother had recently divorced her fourth husband. Yes, fourth. And he left behind a pile of VHS tapes with crappy movies recorded off TV. Every time I went home, I'd grab a few to add to our growing Simpsons library. Before recording over them, I'd always check what was on the tape, since every once in a while, we'd come across a tape with some good movies worth saving. So, I'm sitting in my dorm and popping a tape, and the video starts in a dark room with an empty couch. It clearly looks like a home movie from the quality. Then, an attractive girl in her mid-20s walks into the shot. She starts to undress. Then she reaches off the camera and grabs 3 cucumbers. At this point, I decided I have to share this with the world, and within 5 minutes, have most of my dorm floor on my room to watch the video. That's when I realized that the couch she's sitting on, which I didn't pay attention to before this, is the same couch that is currently sitting in my mom's family room that my ex-stepfather left behind. That this girl is in his apartment that I had visited a few times before he moved in with us. A friend of mine who lived a few doors down asked if he could borrow the tape to watch the rest, and I just wanted it out of my room, so I said yes. I never saw the tape again or sat on that couch again. A few years later, my mom and I ended up taking a bid about her fourth husband, and I asked, "Did you ever notice anything odd about him?" She said, "Well, I never told you this, but the reason I divorced him was I came home and found him in bed with another man." So, there's that. Story 2. My cousin, at time in her 20s, married a guy in his 40s who came with an adult kid, a son, 18 at the time, from a previous relationship. My cousin pumped out a couple kids with this man. Couple years pass, and my cousin is caught in bed with her husband's adult son, now in his mid-20s, while my cousin was in her 30s. This led to a divorce, with my cousin retaining custody of her children. Afterward, she continued her relationship with her former stepson, and they eventually had children together as well. The dude is now a stepfather to his own half-siblings, and his own biological kids are half-siblings to his own half-siblings. We don't talk about my cousin anymore. Story 3. My aunt was a hoarder, and none of us had ever been in her house. We had suspected for years that she was a lesbian, but it was never confirmed. This was my grandfather's sister, so she was born around 1913. They were also very Southern and very Baptist, not exactly a coming-out friendly generation or environment. She was more than a little bit weird, but in a fun way. She was always hilarious to be around and would crack jokes that made other family members clutch their pearls. She was a world traveler with her friend and never had kids. Her friend, who we also never met, was her sole beneficiary, along with a cat rescue. It was always sad to us that she never felt comfortable sharing her life with us, but I think that generation just never really felt comfortable. She died very unexpectedly after falling in the shower in the early 90s, and my mom and some of her cousins went to clean her home out. While they were there, they were going through pictures to figure out which ones her siblings might want, and came across thousands of pictures of dongs. Not real-life ones, but zoomed-in ones from statues, paintings, etc., all from around the world. My aunt had zoomed into just the dong on all the art. They could find no other pictures of the full piece of art. So, for instance, there was the David, but only his dong. No picture of the whole statue in its entirety that they could find. My mom and her cousin spent a full day having so much fun, laughing, drinking wine, and trying to figure out what piece of art around the world that dong belonged to. This was pre-Google, so they had to try and do it from memory. One of the cousins still has the photos and has apparently turned it into a board game of sorts that she plays with friends. Story 4. My cousin and her husband, both in their 50s, became seriously ill with a strange condition. The doctors couldn't pinpoint a diagnosis, but the symptoms resembled liver failure, so they advised them to stop drinking. They followed the advice, but 5 months later, my cousin passed away, and then exactly 1 month later, her husband did too. Their children, in their 20s, were living in the same house, and my mom and I visited to offer support and gather some of my cousin's belongings. We noticed antifreeze in the kitchen and a funnel with antifreeze near an empty medicine bottle in the bathroom. My dad and I have strong suspicions that they gave that to their parents. They never even seemed to care that their parents passed away. Since then, they moved away and don't talk to anyone in the family anymore. Story 5. My dad had an affair with my mom's best friend, which led to my parents' divorce. Afterward, he dated the woman he'd had the affair with for about 4 years, but they eventually broke up. Later, she married my dad's best friend. My dad met someone new, and now both couples are best friends and swing together. Meanwhile, my mom offed herself. Story 6. I married into a NSFW scandal-filled family. My husband has struggled with porn addiction issue, which unfortunately runs in the family. His father also battles this addiction. Meanwhile, his mother, who has dealt with years of emotional neglect, uses alcohol as a way to cope with both her husband's issues and the manipulation that comes with it. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated. My husband's sister has her own set of struggles. She has a history of unhealthy attachments to the men in her life, especially her brother and father. Her jealousy toward anyone they dated became so intense that when she failed to disrupt both my relationship and her brother's, she had a severe emotional breakdown. She even made troubling comments about self-harm, which made things much worse. Because of her behavior, she wasn't invited to our wedding, but she still tried to make an entrance. She wore a very ill-fitting black dress, refused to smile in any professional photos, and disrupted the ceremony by acting out inappropriately. She also got excessively drunk, sneaked in her own alcohol, and caused a scene by making uncomfortable advances toward the men at the wedding, which were rejected by everyone. There's more. She's openly bragged in a drunken state about inappropriate relationships with multiple colleagues, which some of her exes have verified. She's also a high school history teacher, and many of us are just waiting for the day she ends up on the news due to questionable actions with students. She has a difficult time maintaining a relationship for longer than a few weeks, always needing attention from someone, regardless of their background. Her most recent situation involved a much older man, whose relationship status is unclear, but it's clear she's in a very unstable dynamic. When I first met her, she was dating a man who repeatedly tried to break up with her, only to be met with dramatic and manipulative behavior. She would pretend to be in a life-threatening situation, call family members to say goodbye, then return to normal the next day as if nothing had happened. Her behavior, unfortunately, started in childhood and has only worsened. Her mother wanted to get her help, but her father was against it, worried it would damage the family's reputation. I casually suggested she might be dealing with a personality disorder, which led to a huge confrontation with her father, and I learned quickly not to bring it up again. Her most recent boyfriend was a convicted felon, someone with a history of drug dealing and smuggling. They moved in together soon after meeting, and she allowed him to continue his illegal activities from their home, as long as she had access to substances herself. Her father, knowing she struggles to make ends meet, quietly pays for her bills, including her mortgage, car payment, and groceries, so she can focus on her addictions. When her relationship with this man ended, her father even threatened to ruin his life if he ever spoke out about her actions. On top of everything, she has an unhealthy attachment to her dog, and her recent social media posts seem to blur the line between affection and something much stranger. With no boyfriend in the picture, it seems the dog might be filling that role. There's always something going on with this family, and it's definitely never dull. Story 7. In the early 1950s, my grandmother, in her late 20s, was going through her usual morning routine when she picked up the newspaper. As she flipped through the pages, she stopped at the baby announcement section. There, she was shocked to see a congratulatory message directed to my grandfather, welcoming a baby girl. But there was a problem. My grandmother had not given birth to a daughter. She had 2 small sons at home, my dad and my uncle. Confused and embarrassed, she immediately called the newspaper to demand a retraction. The person on the other end confirmed that it was no mistake and insisted the announcement was accurate. It was then that my grandmother learned the truth. Her husband, the fire chief of their town, had gotten a 19-year-old high school girl pregnant. The girl lived in a town over, and my grandfather had been involved with her behind my grandmother's back. At that time, divorce was unheard of and considered a social taboo. Women who divorced were often ostracized, and my grandmother knew that if she went through with it, she would be outcast by the entire town. But she didn't care. That night, she confronted my grandfather. She made it clear she would never be married to him again, no matter what the cost. She threw him out and filed for divorce. She would rather be an outcast than stay with a man who had betrayed her trust. My grandmother was one of the strongest, most independent women I've ever known. As for the girl, her pregnancy was considered an extreme taboo, especially since it was out of wedlock. She was taken out of school and hidden away in a convent for the remainder of her pregnancy. She eventually gave birth to my biological aunt. Shortly after my grandparents' divorce was finalized, my grandfather married the girl, and they went on to have 2 more children, my 2 youngest uncles. They stayed married for the rest of their lives. Most people in the family didn't know the full story. My biological aunt was told that my grandfather had simply divorced my grandmother and then met his new wife, but the true circumstances were kept a secret. Only a few of us know the full details. One of my aunts, by marriage to my youngest uncle, found out years later. She drunkenly blurted out the truth to my sister one night, swearing her to secrecy. I'm fairly certain that my biological aunt still doesn't know the complete story, but I believe my other uncles and aunts are aware of it. My first grandmother went on to remarry years later, after my dad and uncle were grown up. She found a great guy, and they shared a love that lasted until the end. He tragically died in a car accident when she was out of state for my 8th grade graduation. After his passing, she spent the last few years of her life living with my oldest uncle, refusing to go into a retirement home. She outlived my second grandfather too, the man she divorced so many years ago. Story 8. This isn't my family, but it's a story about my ex-girlfriend, who was adopted by a Southern Italian couple when she was just a baby. They raised her in a big Italian family, and she grew up immersed in Italian culture, even though she was originally from Korea. She was about 10 months old when they brought her home. When she was around 23, during her last year of college, she met a small group of Korean girls who were part of a foreign exchange program. Spending time with them made her realize how much she didn't know about her heritage. That sparked a deep desire to search for her biological parents. After about 2 years of searching, she finally connected with her biological parents, and that's when the truth came out. Her father, who was Chinese, had assaulted her mother. The father was arrested and sent to prison. While he was incarcerated, the mother's family pressured her to give up the baby, which was my ex. However, the mother secretly kept in touch with the father while he was in prison, and eventually, they fell in love. This caused a huge scandal, and her mother's family cut her off because they couldn't accept the situation. Despite the shame, the mother moved in with the father, and they went on to have 3 more children. Life was difficult for them, living in poverty. My ex was devastated by these revelations. She discovered that her father was a criminal, that her mother had children with him, and that she was abandoned by a wealthy Korean family. She also learned that her siblings, who were living with her mother, had no interest in building a relationship with her. I remember her crying and shouting, "I should have just learned the language and left this all alone." This happened about 12 years ago, and I'm not sure what's happened since. She reached out to me about 2 years ago, hoping to reconnect, but I never responded. Now, I find myself wondering what became of her. Story 9. My hyper-religious, super-conservative godfather, 75M, is a doctor. He worked as a gyno in a public hospital geared towards those in need. He had a child out of wedlock with one of his patients. Apparently, though highly unethical, there was no abuse involved, and the mother actually wanted him, and they proceeded to have a whole affair during her appointments, which became increasingly frequent. The family found out when the child was already in her teens. My godmother was suspicious about a few monthly expenses that seemed to be increasing and decided to investigate. He was paying a buttload of child support, kind of like a shut-up money. She was, of course, devastated. His son-in-law, who saw him as this inspirational alpha father, leader man of God figure, and always wanted to follow his lead, legitimately had a mental breakdown when everyone found out and ended up in a psych ward for 3 months. Story 10. I had a coworker years ago who had a rather unusual situation. She was married to her stepbrother, which might have been more acceptable if they had met as adults, but they had actually grown up together as siblings. That was already a bit strange from an outsider's perspective, but it gets more complicated. Her stepbrother/husband ended up getting her pregnant. About 6 months after their baby was born, her husband revealed that he was gay and was having an affair with her biological brother, who, like him, had grown up together with her. Her stepbrother then left her to be with her actual brother, leaving her to raise her child on her own. To make matters even more confusing, her biological brother, now in a relationship with her ex-husband, was also considered her child's stepfather and uncle. It's a really complex and awkward situation, and I can only imagine how tense family gatherings like Thanksgiving dinners must be. Story 11. My grandfather was murdered decades ago. The cops knew who did it, but they could never find the guy. My mom is the youngest of 7, and she was always close to this brother. She said she always felt safe around him. He was a steelworker and would cuss like a sailor, but he was always a softie around us kids. Family was important to him. On his deathbed in the hospital, he asked my mom to come closer and told the rest of us to leave the room. My dad took us out of the room, and we waited in the hall. My mom comes out crying and pale as a sheet. My father grabs her and asks her what's wrong. She whispers something into his ear, and my dad loses all color in his face and runs down the hall to a phone. This was way before cell phones. I looked into my uncle who was still alive. He just smiled at me and laid there. My uncle was 19 when my grandfather was murdered, and he knew who the guy who did it. So, he found him the same night and killed him. He buried the body in the woods on family land and never told a soul until he knew he was going to die himself. My dad and mom called the police, but my uncle died before they got there. Later they dug in the spot he told my mom, and they found a skeleton. My mom and dad never talked about it again, and they would get pissed if my brothers or sister would bring it up. My parents are both gone now, as are all of her siblings. We cousins never talk about it. His daughters deny it totally, even after hearing that I still loved my uncle and never thought any different of him. Story 12. I had an uncle, let's call him Ralph, who was married to Alice. Their relationship was extremely toxic. They'd get drunk and often ended up in physical fights. One day, Ralph posted on social media about how sad he was that Alice had finally left him. This wasn't surprising, as we often heard from family members, "Oh yeah, we saw Aunt Alice at the Piggly Wiggly. She's teaching in another state now." So, we all just assumed she'd moved on with her life. Fast forward about 7 years, and Uncle Ralph was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. After exhausting treatment options, the doctors told him he had only a short time left. He called the whole family together to say goodbye, packing his hospital room with relatives, including a 13-year-old Stormtrooper Bob. Then, he made a shocking confession. 7 years earlier, he had taken Aunt Alice's life and buried her in the woods where he liked to hunt. Ralph passed away a week later, and the police found Aunt Alice's remains, allowing her to finally be laid to rest. That's my family scandal in a nutshell. Story 13. I could write a book. When I say my family is messed up, I feel like I take the cake. My uncle, my dad's older brother, was married to my mom before I was born and had my 2 older siblings. When my uncle was young, he went to prison for a murder connected to some gang violence. My dad stepped in to help my mom, who was now raising 2 young kids on her own, and they eventually fell in love. 6 years later, they had me and my younger sibling. Fast forward 25 years, and my uncle gets out of prison. But now, his younger brother, my dad, had become his ex-wife's husband and was the father figure to his 2 adult children, who wanted nothing to do with him. The first Thanksgiving after his release was awkward, to say the least. After a while, my uncle moved in with my grandpa while on parole, but things didn't settle down. He got back into gang-related trouble, causing tension and drama within our family, especially with my aunt, my dad's younger sister. She was frustrated by the constant issues he was causing, and because we lived in different states, we didn't fully understand how serious the situation had become. The situation escalated when a neighbor my uncle had been fighting with snuck into my grandpa's house while he was alone and shot him, killing him while he was reading the newspaper. Our family was devastated. It was hard to believe that all the chaos my uncle had brought into our lives had led to something this tragic. Then, within a few months, things took another dark turn. My aunt's husband, my uncle by marriage, lured my dad's brother to their home and shot him. So, in the span of just a few months, my grandpa was murdered by his neighbor, and my uncle was murdered by another family member. It's hard to even process everything that happened. Story 14. My great-grandmother left my great-grandfather after they had 2 kids because she didn't like being a mom. While she was gone, she literally started working as a sex worker. A little under 2 years after she left, she came back and dropped off a kid for my great-grandfather to take care of. 6 years after that, she came back, took my great-aunt, and gave her to her biological father. I believe a year after that, she came back and decided she was ready to be a mother to my grandmother and great-aunt. My great-grandfather and her were together for the rest of their lives. He took care of her when she was deathly ill to the day she died over 40 years later. My second great-aunt tracked down my great-grandfather in her early 20s and lived the rest of her life like she had 2 fathers. Needless to say, that family gatherings could be tense at times. Story 15. My great-aunt was married 5 times. Each of her first 4 husbands passed away under different circumstances: a car accident, a heart attack, an injury while working on the property, and one from an unknown cause in his sleep. Her 5th husband offed himself. The whole family has long believed that she may have somehow played a role, directly or indirectly, in each of their fates. I only knew her when I was a little kid, but she definitely had a bitter and mean-spirited side. Story 16. A family member was trying to extort and blackmail the doorman into sleeping with her, threatening to make false accusations if he refused. In response, he fled the situation. When my grandfather learned of this, he took it upon himself to meet with the doorman, offering him compensation for his troubles. As a result, the family distanced themselves from this relative. This same relative also stole her mother's cancer medication. When my very ill aunt discovered this, she confronted her. During the confrontation, my aunt, too weak from chemotherapy, was shoved away, fell to the floor, and was left there for an extended period before another relative found her. In a separate incident, this relative was following her sister, trying to discover her whereabouts due to an inheritance dispute following my aunt's death. When the sister noticed and became alarmed, she reached out to my mom, who lives in a highly secure compound. The sister decided to seek refuge with my mom, but the cousin followed her. Security at the compound blocked the cousin's entry, but she ignored the rules and rammed her car into 2 security personnel. The police arrived promptly, and she was escorted out. Story 17. In 1970, I was about 6 or 7 years old. I had just come home from first grade and was watching TV when one of my aunts came in and told me to turn off the television and go upstairs. Later that day, I learned the news. My grandfather, who struggled with a severe drinking problem, had been in a 1-car accident with my 3 younger siblings. None of them were wearing seatbelts. My youngest brother was thrown through the car windshield, suffering severe brain and skull injuries. He lived for only a few more months before passing away. For some reason, my baby brother was buried without a tombstone. The family, however, largely supported my grandfather, acknowledging his poor judgment, but still calling him a good man. As a young child, I couldn't understand any of this. I kept wondering why my brother wasn't coming home from the hospital like my other siblings had. 40 years later, as an adult, I wanted to make things right by providing a grave marker for my brother. I paid for it out of my own pocket, and with the help of the cemetery, I arranged for a marker to be installed in 2010. However, when I did this, many extended family members criticized me, saying that I was reopening old wounds. They insisted that my grandfather's actions were simply a tragic mistake, and that my brother was now an angel in heaven. To this day, I choose not to drink alcohol, and I have cut ties with my family for good. I can't accept their view of what happened and how they've handled it. They can believe what they want, but I'm at peace with my decision. Story 18. I had a cousin who I used to admire. He was very active in veteran support circles and had been recognized at various events, including baseball and hockey games. He was a fun, non-judgmental, and well-liked young veteran, often seen as the family's golden boy. His reputation as a hero grew even more after being diagnosed with cancer, which was believed to be linked to his time in Iraq, possibly due to exposure to burn pits. He passed away earlier this year. However, about 3.5 years ago, his younger brother shared with me that he had been abused by him as a teenager. To make matters worse, I found out that much of his military service in Iraq had been exaggerated. He mostly did desk work in a secure area during a relatively peaceful period after Saddam's fall, yet he portrayed himself as a major figure in veteran advocacy, taking credit for the work actually done by his younger brother, who served in Afghanistan. The victim cousin provided evidence of this, including text messages and a recorded conversation where the cousin admitted to the abuse. This revelation has deeply divided our extended family. My immediate family, including my dad's cousin's family, as well as my uncle, the father of the 2 brothers, and his wife, are supporting the victim. Unfortunately, none of us, including the victim and his family, were invited to the funeral. The rest of the family seems to ignore the facts and pretend it never happened. What's especially painful is that for years, the victim cousin was unfairly labeled as the black sheep of the family, with his brother controlling the narrative and tarnishing his reputation while presenting himself as a hero, despite not having seen combat. In many ways, his passing due to cancer may have been seen as the end of a complicated story. Story 19. My mom was adopted. In her 50s, she discovered that she had several biological siblings. It turns out that her biological father was very controlling and didn't want his much younger wife to keep their children. The first 5 children were given up for adoption immediately after birth in the 1950s and 1960s. He allowed her to keep the youngest child, a son, Junior. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, when Junior came across some old paperwork that led him to discover he had older siblings. He began searching for them, and with the help of an organization, they were able to locate everyone. The siblings included a doctor, an elevator repairman, a man with brain damage from a motorcycle accident, Junior, my mom, and another sister, I'll call her Trumpet. They arranged a family reunion at a cabin in Pigeon Forge. At the gathering, the doctor quickly decided he wasn't interested in connecting and left after just a few hours. Junior, although slower, was happy to have found his siblings. The man with brain damage had some difficulty communicating, and Trumpet was excited to meet her sister. The elevator repairman stepped out for a bit, but returned with gifts of moonshine. While they shared the drinks around the campfire that evening, his comments made everyone uncomfortable as he remarked about how attractive his long-lost sisters were. My mom and her husband left the next morning, and they didn't feel comfortable continuing the reunion. A few weeks later, Trumpet called my mom to share that she had left her husband and kids without a word and had moved to Arizona to be with the elevator repairman, with whom she was now in a relationship. Eventually, both Elevator and Trumpet went through divorces and started a new life together in Florida. Sadly, Elevator later passed away, and Trumpet quickly found a new partner, a 73-year-old trucker. My mom, despite her discomfort, stayed in contact with Trumpet, who shared details about her new relationship, which my mom found disturbing. Sadly, the man with the brain injury also passed away, and Junior remains without the siblings he had hoped to reconnect with. Story 20. There's a cousin in my family who was involved in a troubling incident where his daughter's mother passed away under suspicious circumstances. The cause of death was inconclusive, and toxicology tests didn't provide clear answers, but there were signs of physical trauma. On the day of her death, he left early in the morning with his daughter, saying they were going camping, but it raised a lot of questions. He was never charged, though, due to the lack of clear evidence. The mother of this cousin also has significant mental health issues. At one point, she left my uncle for a man she met online, and when she disappeared, he discovered that she had racked up significant credit card debt and had been hoarding things in their home, like in used appliances and household items. The family, who is very religious, was shocked. My uncle was so distressed that he almost took his life, but my dad reached out to him just in time. Eventually, he found out that the man she left him for was a scam artist who had taken advantage of her financially. For some reason, my uncle took her back, though they later divorced when she was once again in a relationship with someone from abroad. Her other son, my cousin, had a troubled time in high school and ended up living with us for a while. One day, the police raided my parents' house looking for something, but nothing came of it. My dad, who had connections, helped my cousin graduate early, and after that, he was asked to leave. He ended up coming to say goodbye because he had bought a car and was planning to drive cross-country. Sadly, less than a day later, he was pulled over and arrested. They found illegal substances, stolen goods, and counterfeit money in his car. He got a light punishment and continued to make poor choices. Months later, he got into even more trouble when he became involved with a drug trafficking ring and went on the run. I talked to him at that point and told him to stay away from my family, and he actually listened for once. I'm not sure how he got out of that mess, but I suspect he might have cooperated with authorities. Now, he works for a pharmaceutical company, which is ironic given his past. This is just a glimpse into the craziness that runs through part of my family. On my dad's side, there are several families, and each one has its own unique set of challenges and dramas, going back generations. My mom's side, though, is much more calm and stable. Story 21. My grandfather harmed several women in our family, including me, my mother, my aunt, my other aunt who has a disability, and even my young cousin. The abuse occurred at different times. My mom and aunt were around 13 when it happened to them. I was around 7, and my cousin was just 2. My disabled aunt was subjected to this abuse for years, starting when she was about 14, until he was caught when she was 28. None of us knew that the others had been affected. He kept us all silent through manipulation, convincing us that speaking out would get him in trouble and ruin our family. The truth only came to light when my disabled aunt in a work program casually shared her experiences, not realizing that what had happened to her wasn't normal or acceptable. On the day the police came to arrest him, he didn't resist. He went quietly, even laughing. They found a significant number of firearms, including both unregistered and registered weapons. Unfortunately, the justice system failed us. Despite the evidence, he was never charged and we were never granted restraining orders. After the court proceedings, he was allowed to live just a short distance away from us, and he would often taunt and intimidate us. On several occasions, my mom and I have run into him around town. One time, my mom confronted him at a local store, making it clear that she wasn't going to let him intimidate her any longer. Story 22. My dad was 35 when I was born, and I had a rough upbringing. I started partying at a young age and was essentially homeless while trying to finish high school. There was this woman, a few years older than me, who always seemed to make poor choices. She was constantly involved with abusive men, acting recklessly and neglecting her child. Fast forward a few years, after my boyfriend tragically took his own life, I had to move back in with my dad. And, sure enough, this woman, who had just gotten out of jail, walked into our home. It felt like a nightmare. My dad, who had a history of being drawn to troubled women, had bailed her out to come live with him. I tried to warn him. I really did, but he wouldn't listen. I despised her from the moment I met her. A year or two later, I had my own place and was finally settling down with a good job. But then I got a call that shook me. She needed me to bring pregnancy tests after I just finished a long shift. The test came back positive, and I was devastated. I cried for hours, not sure what to do with all of the emotions that overwhelmed me. 4 months later, I had reluctantly accepted that this woman was now part of my life. But then she left my dad to live on the streets. At the time, I had been sobered from stimulants for about 3 years, but my past made me keenly aware of what was happening. 2 or 3 weeks later, when I went to visit my dad, I found her again, skinny, with hollow eyes and a face that looked like it had been through so much. It turns out she had been trying to end her pregnancy with drugs, but when that didn't work, she came back. I remember the fear and heartbreak, wondering if my sibling would even survive. But somehow, against all odds, my baby sister was born during my graveyard shift. I rushed to the hospital after work and found the most beautiful, perfect little girl. I could see pieces of my dad and myself in her, and for the first time in a while I felt relief. However, the hardest part was the day before, when I had seen her high. She was visibly struggling, and I didn't know what to do. I regret not saying something, but at the time, I didn't know if it would have changed anything. After my sister was born, the hospital kept her for a few days, and then took her away. I felt like they took a part of me. All I had ever wanted was a baby sister, and now, I was devastated. It took 2 years, and the severance of that woman's rights, to finally bring my sister home. Now, at 28, I'm 100% committed to her. She's 3, and my dad is 62, but I'll never leave her again. Life is unpredictable, but I've learned to appreciate the small, beautiful things, like finding joy in simple moments, like watching her play with bugs and hearing her ask, "What doing?" Story 23. My mother came from a deeply religious Mormon family. After my grandfather passed away from heart complications, my grandmother remarried a man from the same church. We'll call him Bob. Bob's wife had recently died of cancer, so their marriage was more practical than romantic. Bob had a son, around the same age as my mother, who we'll call Sam. My mother later told me that Sam got her pregnant. So, my step-uncle turned out to be my father. My parents were married for about 10 years before divorcing. Sam struggled with drug abuse and was often absent for long stretches. After I turned 10, I became estranged from him and didn't see much of him again. I'm aware I have a half-sister from him, whom I've spoken to once on the phone. Let's call her Kim. A few months ago, I decided to do a DNA test. To my surprise, the results showed that I have a half-sister, but it wasn't Kim. This was strange. I guess that means I have another half-sister, whom I'll call Brittany, that I never knew about. Considering Sam is a mess, it wasn't shocking, but still unsettling. I don't know Brittany's last name, so I assumed it was her mother's. I reached out to her, and it took about a month for her to reply. I expected her to say something like, "Yes, Sam's my father. He's terrible, and we don't talk anymore." But she surprised me. She claimed that she has a completely different set of parents and said her last name comes from her father. To complicate things further, my 23andMe results showed that I'm 23% Ashkenazi Jewish. I'd always been told I'm English, Irish, and Scandinavian, so where did this come from? It couldn't be from my mother's side, so I figured it must be from my paternal side, but I didn't know much about them. Desperate for answers, I messaged Sam's brother, my uncle, hoping he could shed light on Brittany's last name. My uncle is generally easy to talk to, and there was no way I was reaching out to Sam about this. I also asked him if he knew anything about Ashkenazi Jewish heritage on his side. My uncle said he didn't know anything about it, and mentioned he recognized Brittany's last name. Oh, that guy? Yeah, he was Sam's best friend in high school. Why? It turned out that my real father wasn't Sam after all. It was Sam's best friend. The revelation crushed me. My mom had been lying to me my whole life about my biological father. This, on top of the fact that my mother and I hadn't spoken for years, completely severed our relationship. Sam is no longer my father, but he's still technically my step-uncle. And Kim, whom I thought was my half-sister, isn't even related to me by blood. It's all a lot to process. After digging further, I learned that my real father is homeless, battling drugs, and completely estranged from his family. That doesn't really bother me, though. I wouldn't have reached out to him, even if I could. I eventually confronted my mom to call her out. And of course, she just fed me more lies. She claimed there was never any penetration with Brittany's father. Just some over-the-pants stuff. Whatever. I also confronted Sam to see if he knew about any of this. But it turns out he didn't. At least now he knows he didn't abandon his daughter. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.